Hey everyone, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I am usually joined here by my co host Nathan Toups, but you'll have to forgive us this week. There was a bit of a scheduling issue, so he's not here for this intro clip. But fortunately, this is just an intro clip. I just wanted to set up what we got coming for you. We were fortunate enough to interview Michael Feathers, the author of Working Effectively with Legacy Code. This is really exciting for us. It's a big milestone for the podcast. Michael is the first author we've interviewed who has heard of the podcast before being on it. So it's cool. He responds to some of the stuff we said in our episodes discussing his book. Really great guy, just such a fantastic time to be able to talk with him. I think you're really going to enjoy this interview that's coming up. So please stick around for the whole discussion. This is our interview with Michael Feathers as he reflects on his book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, great. We are really excited to talk to you about your book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. We like to set the stage with all the authors we interview. Just talk to us a bit about what the computer science industry was like when you wrote the book. When, was it 2005 that this was written?
2004.
2004. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to us a bit about what the industry was like at that time and why you felt the need to write this book.
Okay. I spent a good deal of time in the 90s, basically just working in the industry, but in a very cloistered environment in a way. This was in the day of cubicles, and nobody did any kind of pair programming or anything along those lines. I worked in a very highly technical area, and there was this sense that it's kind of like if you're a programmer, you're really smart and you should be able to figure it out by yourself, right? So it was a kind of like a very high pressure situation in a way. And when I first came across the things that became agile, software development, it was just really amazing to me because it basically started to approach us as human beings. And it was kind of nice to go and sort of get involved in that community. And I basically became a consultant soon after I met Kent Beck and other people in the early XP community. And I was going around and helping people out and helping people discover that things like test-driven development can really help you, with the things that you're doing. And refactoring is a thing. You can actually modify code after you've written it, stuff along those lines. And so trying to communicate those practices across different organizations. And the thing that was kind of interesting for me is that, essentially at that time, Martin Fowler had his refactoring book out. But he just had this brief blurb in it, basically going and saying, well, if you're going to do this stuff, you need to have tests. I was working with teams that had no tests at all. And I thought, wow, what do we do here? How do we actually start moving forward with these things? So I think it was like this big transition from technocratic to human that happened, at least in the environments I was in the late 1990s and early 2000s. There really was an awful lot of this. My first job in the industry was writing a compiler for a programming language and designing the programming language on my own in a cubicle, right? I had a boss who was technical and I would talk to him once a week or so. But it was just all on me, mano a mano, just hammer away working on this problem and, hopefully you figure it out. You're smart, right? So that kind of thing. So I think things have changed quite a bit. Programming is far more social now than it has been.
What's your opinion on that development? I think many programmers still get into this industry because they think of it as kind of a solitary pursuit. But I would agree that it's, I haven't been in the industry nearly as long, but I find it to be a social pursuit. I would talk to us a bit about the differences between maybe how it used to be, how it is now, the pros and cons of that.
Yeah, sure. I agree. It's much more social now. And how do I put this? I think it's nice because it's great to be social. It's great to communicate with people and go back and forth and do sorts of things. But, I really was attracted to this as an introvert, right? When I was in high school, I thought it was I'd become a pharmacist because you didn't have to look people in the eye at all when you're going and filling prescriptions. It's like you could be lost in your own thoughts and do this kind of thing. So being, just kind of like a very curious person and an introvert seemed like an ideal place to be. But I think, as you said, things like this have kind of fallen by the wayside a bit, and it is far more social. But on the other hand, too, I think that it still attracts introverts. And I think that quite often, just because you put introverts in a social context doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to be social, right? So we have this thing of misunderstood intentions and all sorts of things. They're kind of like parlance of people that may not have the best social skills. So I think that's still true within the industry.
You have a really good sort of terse definition of legacy code, which I
Yeah.
think in the book was like, it doesn't have test coverage,
Hmm.
which I loved. I thought that was cool. I was wondering, has your definition of legacy code changed over time?
Wow. Okay. Now I get to go and talk about that particular thing, right? How that happened. I was working with a team, and I had a consultant that was helping me, and it's like I got frustrated with the team one day, and I just said, because they were asking me about very simple things. I said, look, if it doesn't have tests, it's legacy code. Just go on that assumption. And the guy who was with me said, you should put that out there someplace. It's really powerful. I'm like, yeah, I guess so. But the thing that I've understood, for a long time, and I think it's kind of a piece of nuance that doesn't carry sometimes, is that anybody can make a definition, right? And no one definition is right. And quite often, if you're adopting a definition, it's because it's giving you some impetus to action. It goes and galvanizes you in a particular way. Now, the reasoning for this one that I basically give is that essentially it's like once you have tests in place, you're in a completely different environment. You're able to go and do things that you wouldn't be able to do with having the tests in place and having the surety of being able to have like this, this scaffolding that will catch you when things go wrong. So it's one definition, and I think it's a useful one for people to hear when they're trying to go and galvanize themselves towards action and going and working in the code base. But of course, there's legacy code is something you got from somebody else. There's all these other things where legacy code is the code that you're scared of. None of them are right. None of them are wrong. They're all just different facets, different ways of looking at the problem.
You we are always interested in how our authors gain their expertise to write the different books.
Mhm.
I do not envy the amount of expertise you must have had to have gained to become an expert on working effectively with legacy code. Talk to us a bit about that journey and how you kind of found yourself constantly working in projects where this was such a necessary skill set.
Yeah, I had a long period of experience in a biomedical company back in Miami, Florida, where I used to live. And I worked on a bunch of different projects. And it was around that time, late in my career there, that I basically started discovering, what automated testing could do for you. And it was really hard to go and convince people around me that this was a decent thing to do. It was a very strange environment. Um, in terms of expertise, a lot of it became this thing of becoming a consultant and going to team after team and starting to go notice commonality among the problems that people had, right? And I really recommend that to people who want to go and get some depth in software development, is that quite often we think that depth is basically going and digging into one particular area, but you have to have like this substrate of experience in many different realms. And I was amazed. I started working with Robert Martin like way back in like 2000 or so. And it was funny because we'd go and visit clients and they would start to tell him about their system. That was always the question, tell me about your system. And what was funny is that he'd start to fill in the story for them. They'd say
Mm.
one thing and he'd say, well, I guess, and this is happening too, right? I thought, oh my God, what a genius, what a marvel, this kind of thing, right? And it, took a while to kind of realize it's just a matter of exposure to many different things, right? And that's a really powerful thing. When you think about it, that's just like, AI is really all the vogue right now, but essentially it's the way training happens. It's kind of like with enough training and impressions of many different things, you start to see the patterns. And I think that that's been a very useful thing for me. That and just, I love reflecting on things. I'm a very curious person. And it's like, I will go back to code I've written years ago and say, gee, could I do this better? Or what's an alternative that I could have done in this particular case? And yeah, I think that's just where it's kind of come from in a sense.
I like what you say about getting exposure to those different systems. I kind of in my career, for one reason or another, I've hopped jobs more often than I would have liked. And
Yeah,
I wish I could develop some of that depth you're talking about. But at the same time, you get exposures to how lots of different companies are operating. And it's fun to
yeah.
see the commonalities, the differences. Not everyone can be a consultant and not everyone can or should switch companies as often as maybe I have. What are your recommendations for um, getting exposure to different software systems if maybe you're at the same company or have been there for a while?
Just a lot of reading. There's a lot of open source out there. There's like no end of resources we can use right now to get exposure to different problems and things along those lines. I think it really comes down to going in and just recognizing that it's out there, right? Just about anything that you're curious about, you can discover something about. If you want to understand, the code for the space shuttle, it's like it's out there, right? You can take a look at that and sort of like try to put yourself in the minds of the people who are developing that from the beginning and the constraints that they had, and think about how the constraints affected what they produced. And it's amazing to me because quite often I think that we don't do that enough. It's kind of like little thing I like to say is that essentially it's like if you go to a small regional airport and you see like a little hot dog stand and there's a guy selling hot dogs and stuff like that, he's in the same business as a Michelin star chef, right? It's kind of like the amount of variation that occurs within the industry is just so large. You think that everybody uses version control? No, right? It's kind of like all these things that we assume are the typical and the right way of developing software. There are islands, off in the distance of people who have had very little contact with modern practice. I see that sort of thing periodically. And yeah, it's a wider world than we, really anticipate or really, expect to see.
So I would imagine this book opened up a whole bunch of doors. And then since writing it, you were able to see teams and legacy code bases. I would love to know, have you noticed any trends in changes to like the problems affecting folks in legacy code? Or is this like Sisyphus where we're actually keep running into the same problems over and over again?
Well, we do have a generational problem because every new generation has to go and sort of like figure things out, right? It depends on who teaches them. It depends on what books they read, who they encounter in the industry, and who they work with, right? So there's that ramp up. But I think in general, it's like a lot of the testing stuff is kind of like it's well reflected in good practice today. It's kind of like it's hardly ever the case that I encounter teams that don't really have much in the way of testing these days. So I think in a way, it's kind of like, my book is still giving value to a lot of people that are making their own personal journey. But I think in many cases, it's kind of like sideswiped by reality a bit. I think things are getting better. So that's just my take on it.
What's your take on I've seen a lot of swirling around the idea that maybe one place where artificial intelligence could be really practical is in testing. That once the code is actually written, AI might be really good at generating the tests for it. I mean, I know anecdotally I've been able to get it to write tests. You could imagine maybe full AI developed test suites. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a great deep topic. I'm glad you brought that up. It's funny. I went to a conference, I guess, about a year and a half ago or so, and there was a representative of one of the companies that does AI work. And he was talking about, hey, it's like, we can do all the things that developers don't like to do, like write tests. We'll just write the test for you. And I'm like, no, And it's, I've really come around on this quite a bit. It's like, so in one of the earlier sessions you had where you talked about my book, you mentioned characterization testing, right? Which is all about going in, documenting the current behavior of a system using tests. And, there's a lot to that can just be done automatically to some degree. And it's great that the semantics of the code can be reflected in the names that the tests, have based upon the generated tests have. At the end of the day, we have to go and look at them and figure out whether they serve us or not. But it seems like it's a really cool thing. I think that we should be able to be moving further into a world where essentially we can see tests as disposable to some degree. We want to have a set of tests that reflect our intentions that we can use all the time. But if there's an area that we need to go and get more surety in, it's actually generating tests in that space is, a very useful thing to be able to do. So yeah, I see that as being like an advantageous thing. On artificial intelligence itself, it's kind of tough if you come from a TDD background because it's so easy to generate things, right? And forever we've had like code completion and all these other things that are available to us, but we've always sort of like told ourselves, hey, we shouldn't be going and just like accepting generated code. I think right now, because the hallucination problem remains real, and I believe it's going to remain real for a long, long time. I believe it's endemic to LLM technology. I think we're probably in a better space now where we can basically use AI for a lot of ideation. Give me a different way of doing these things. And then that puts us in this very strong, review realm where it's kind of like, okay, here's an idea I just got. Does that really have merit at all? Do I want to do that? Do I want to drop what I'm doing and do that? Do I want to do something else? Do I want to ask again and get a different idea? So I see a lot of value in that. And by the way, I'm actually working on a book right now about AI assisted programming. And just released a couple of chapters yesterday on LeanPub. But it's one of those things where I kind of feel it might have relatively short shelf life because things are changing so much. But I also feel there are some durable things that really are significant considering the fact that we've dealt with this problem for a while. Like, how do we deal with something that, was given to us as opposed to having written ourselves?
What's the name of the book?
AI assisted programming.
Very cool. We're reading one called Pair Programming with ChatGPT because that's yeah, I think it's something we're all obviously very interested in.
Cool.
Is
I'll
how
have to
is
check that one out.
yeah, it's great.
Well,
Well,
that's
go ahead,
interesting
Nathan.
too. Yeah. So I do platform engineering work in my current employer, and we've just started sending out quarterly developer experience surveys. And
Mhm.
one of the interesting things that we found, just started adding in do you use something like Copilot? And then looking at, it's kind of interesting because it gave us the qualitative and quantitative analysis, and the teams that have embraced the coding assistants the most actually have the highest rate of developer satisfaction in the organization. And what we don't
Nice.
know yet, we don't know if it's causal or if it's that the same people that have the wanderlust to go and get assistance tools are also just gung ho
Yeah, it could
about
be like a cohort effect, and it's also
exactly
because of the novelty right now too. Perhaps, who knows?
right. Um, but I will say there's a couple of folks that I've seen use it in a way that it's fascinating because I would already have categorized those folks as like very highly productive and very competent programmers if they didn't
Mhm.
have. And they use this as sort of, this almost like a sounding board or a rubber ducky to kind of
Mhm.
like ideate quickly.
Yeah, no, it really amplifies you at whatever skill level you happen to be at. And I also believe that one of the things is it basically leads us to go and formulate better questions, right?
Oh yeah,
I think that's really like, aside from people worry about it replacing us, but it makes us better also. So I think that's kind of cool.
it was fascinating. I was building a React app, just my personal time, and I need to set some sort of environment variable. And so I was just chatting with ChatGPT. It'd been a while since I had done anything like that in React, and I was like, I want to do something like an environment variable or a config file, and it gave me kind of the options for both like environment variables and config files.
Mhm.
The environment variables were way simpler than the
Mhm.
implementation than the config file. So I asked it. I was like, okay, this seems way simpler. Why would anyone do a config file? And it was great. It just gave me, it's like, well, a config file might be great for
Yeah.
this reason, right? I found it to be enormously helpful. I'm
Mhm.
working remote these days, and nothing will replace bouncing ideas off of coworkers. But I found for little quick explainers or rubber ducking, it's
Yeah.
been remarkably helpful.
Yeah, definitely is.
Well, you talk about the hallucination problem. We read Stephen Wolfram's "What is ChatGPT doing and why does it work?"
Yeah.
That was something we came away with it too, that the hallucination problem might be kind of fundamentally intractable.
Mhm.
Um, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we can't stop people from hallucinating, right? It's almost like the thing with like AI alignment. We've never been able to align human beings,
Hmm.
so it's yeah, no, I think it is endemic. I think the thing that really kind of gets me a little bit more is the issue with procedural reasoning. It doesn't seem to be quite there yet. And if you have show notes, I'll send a link to the paper. But there was somebody who wrote a paper earlier this year was basically going and talking about how relative to good planning AI software, a lot of these LLMs just fall flat on their backs, right? Um, there's something that they refer to as called the block world problem. And it's kind of like if you have a series of
Yes.
blocks in a particular structure, right? And you want to go and create a different structure, what are the steps that you actually need to go and do to produce this, right? And the interesting thing with it was that it seems like they would get good results given a description of the problem, a description of the moves that are possible. But once they actually start to change the nouns and the verbs in the description of what was possible to just nonsense nouns and verbs, it just fell apart because it wasn't actually just going in sort of honing in on the structure of the problem. It's really going in sort of like coloring it with the semantics of the words that were used to
Uh-huh.
describe it. So it's like it merges structure and semantics together in a rather deep way, and it's kind of like a way which is kind of hard to tease apart. One of the early things I was kind of wondering about is like, could I actually see how well it could do structural reasoning? And I had this little thing. I thought, okay, well, I'll ask GPT. It's kind of like, what's this? What's the commonality between a zip function and a transpose function, right? And it would always tell me, well, they're used for different things. It's kind of like there's no real similarity. But if you actually look at a zip function, it's like a degenerate matrix transpose. It's like a matrix transpose where you have two rows and many columns, right? You just sort of do a transpose. And that's something you only really arrive at through structural reasoning, sort of like knowing what something is used for and going and seeing the structure that's underneath it. So I think we still have a leg up on that as humans.
Hmm.
But I feel pretty strongly that people are going to start, adding in auxiliary tools that are used by LLMs, or orchestrated to go and actually make a lot of these capabilities a bit better. So.
A fun little trick you can play in LLMs is if you give them common riddles like a man and his son are in a car accident. They go to the hospital. The doctor says, "I cannot operate. This is my son." But if you word it to be like a man and his son are in a car accident, they go to the hospital to the doctor, who is emphatically female, and says, "I cannot operate on the son." It'll respond and say, "Oh, the doctor." Like it'll, or no, you go to the doctor and say the doctor, who is emphatically male. Like if you flip it around, it'll say, "Oh, the doctor is the boy's mother," even though you told it the doctor is a man. Because because it's just like you said, it's just kind of semantic. It's trained on everything that's come before. It's seen that riddle a million times, and so it gives the most likely answer. It doesn't actually understand what's being said to it.
Right. It's giant. It's a giant pattern matching machine. And I think what's kind of fascinating is I took a lot of cognitive science in school. It's kind of like this is just the way human brain is. It's kind of like we have different regions for doing different things. And I'm sure that many of you have seen. Many people are really good at pattern matching, but not very good at stringing together logical arguments. So, and vice versa. It happens. So.
Yeah, it got back to the I think Claude Shannon had his definition of entropy, and I think this is just an excellent example of if large language models work the way that we know they work, and it's actually giving a statistical probability of what the next token would be, then it's not actually new information, right? It literally can't be. And therefore it's a low entropy. It's actually a low entropy system, but it's like it can handle the number of variables that we can't comprehend. So it looks fascinating and novel and new to us, but really it's like reaching into dimensions that we can't see. And even that though is fascinating. It's like finding these, unconventional relationships between stuff. I think it's still pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's fun. It's kind of reinvigorated me a bit. It's like the legacy code thing I've been dealing with for years, and fun. And there is an overlap between AI and legacy code stuff, but it's just, it's a frontier. It's fun.
Someone's going to write a really great book in like 20 years called "Working Effectively with AI Generated Code."
Legacy code. I'm not sure it's very much different.
Turns out the AI
misunderstanding sometimes.
the AI generated code also doesn't have test coverage. So
yeah.
Well, talk to us a bit about the legacy of your book and kind of any backlash to it or responses to it. What's the reception been like as the author?
Generally really positive, and I was surprised by that just because I guess some people say that essentially if you have a book that has more than a certain amount of code, people aren't going to read it, right? But I felt it was very important to go and have lots of code examples and in different languages, if only to go and make the point that we should all be able to read multiple languages. If we aren't, then that's just, you have to figure that out, right? People have found it very useful, and that's the thing I really intended for it. I saw what was happening in the industry as a problem, and I thought, okay, there are things that we can do right now to actually solve this problem. And here they are. The people that are basically reading this are probably under stress. I remember when I listened to y'all talk about the book a little bit earlier, you were talking about the thing that a lot of the chapters have just like the names are just like the name of a problem or the name of a question, right? That was part of a rewrite because I had a lot of theory in the very beginning.
Oh, interesting.
And I abandoned it all because I thought, my God, nobody's going to want to read this. These are people that need some help, right? So if they can just flip and basically find their problem and read a chapter that goes and describes the problem, then, that'll be useful. So I don't know. I think the thing that I really feel very happy about is that it's been useful to people. The criticisms I've heard a couple of people say it's like, you're teaching people how to make bad code worse, that kind of thing, right? And stuff like that. Or a friend of mine actually said, it's interesting. It's like, none of these things are really new, Michael. You're just giving people permission to do them. And I'm like, fine,
Well, we really liked that about it. And that's something we mentioned in the last episode. And thank you so much for listening to the episodes. We were telling you before we were telling you before we recorded. This is a great milestone for the podcast because I think you're the first author or who's heard the episode before coming on.
Cool.
But we, I kind of compared it in a similar way to Uncle Bob's Clean Coder, where I said it was like almost an aspirational book. And I mentioned this in the last episode where I worked in what could maybe be construed as a legacy code base at my last job, and everyone was just so scared to touch it. And this last job had really accomplished engineers, and so I kind of thought, whoa, I'm not smarter than these guys and gals. And so if they're scared to touch it, then that's just the right thing to do. It's just right to be scared. And kind of in the same way where you said, yeah, it gives you permission. You're just like, to me, it was so great to read this book and see like, oh, No, you don't have to be scared. There is a way to reason about these things, and it
Hmm.
has been done before.
Hmm.
Um, I think with the industry, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Like for an industry that's kind of constantly on the forefront of new developments, it's surprising, like you said, kind of like how Robert Martin could just tell the story because he's heard it 100 times before.
Hmm.
Yeah, what did you was that something you anticipated when you wrote the book? This idea that you're almost giving like a permission structure or a vision of what could be to maybe discourage developers?
In a way, I think it's kind of like I love helping people see new possibilities, right? Just in general in life, right? If I can figure something out and people feel like, there's three options and I can give them a fourth, that's great. And I think I kind of touched on it in the very last chapter of the book that really it's a morale thing. People need to kind of like be bolstered up sometimes when they're doing these things. I think one thing I really wish I'd kind of underlined in the book was that so much of what's happening in these systems, if you're trying to motivate yourself, is kind of like an 80-20 problem. It's kind of like, the areas that you're touching right now are likely areas you're going to be touching in the future. And it's kind of like if you get them under test now, that's an area of code that never needs to be gotten under test again. So there is this compounding value that comes from going and tackling the hard areas of a system that receive a lot of change. And yeah, so that's kind of it's a positive story, and it's great to be able to give people a positive story to motivate themselves.
Yeah, I love this idea of the giving permission piece. It actually reminds me of, I would imagine this is probably how fitness gurus or nutritionists feel. It's not like,
Yeah.
but some people just don't have the framework to even think about, how do I actually plan my meals or how do I actually do a workout?
Mhm.
I mean, if you look at marathons, right, it's a very simple concept. It's like 26 miles. You
Yeah.
start,
Yeah.
then you finish it. But yeah, like building up the courage or understanding like how do I actually train for this. I think, sometimes you have to reach outside.
I've run a
Um,
couple marathons and can verify that it is simple, but it's not easy.
right. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
I would love it. Do you have any anecdotes or any like success stories of teams you've worked with where you've seen that transformation, where you really walked into something that was really a mess and then were able to sort of affect change or make impact?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fascinating thing because sometimes, how can I say, there's the technical changes, but it's really what people take away from them in terms of what they think is possible. That's kind of a very positive thing. A very early experience. I worked with a team in London, and this is like way back in the early days, and they had a CTO who was a bit odd, and they had this giant pile of code, and just by going and actually getting them to change practice a bit and actually see what was possible in the code base, they were able to start moving along in a very good way. But it's kind of funny because if you look at the code as a before and after, like a giant code base, you'll hardly ever be able to tell that it's kind of like, oh, wow, things are different now. Because, usually in a very large code base, you're not touching things very often at all. It's the new stuff that comes in that basically reflects the better practice and also how people feel about what they're doing going forward with things. Um, so yeah, there's always going to be these difficult areas in the code base that have been there for years. It's a question of how you approach them when you need to go and actually make the changes that seems pretty important with a lot of these things. It's not like you overnight turn a giant code base into a marvel, something that you would be proud to show your mom, right? It's just it's just that you know what to do when you're encountering something that's really thorny, and move on from that. Yeah, it's that kind of thing.
I like the idea of showing my code base to my mom and getting berated by her. Like, oh, Carter, this code is awful. Clean your code.
Yeah, and you say, I know, I know, I know.
Have you run into teams that have so we talk a lot about code and lack of test coverage. I've actually seen some environments in which things like the CI/CD process or how they've broken code out into like separate repos. Maybe they thought that they were doing separation of concerns or they were vendoring or breaking things in the libraries, but then you get into like diamond dependency hell and other
Mhm.
places. Um, I would love to hear your thoughts on like how does an organization deal with this sort of like structure of how they ship code from a legacy
What?
standpoint?
Just, I mean, yeah, actually, as far as like, how many repos and all these other things and what the,
Yeah,
yeah, I
like
mean, I've seen that happen. It's funny with this because I think one of the moves that people don't quite often do, which I wish that Martin Fowler had like accented an awful lot more in the refactoring book, is I'll put it this way: a lot of refactoring is basically kind of sold as taking big things and breaking them into small pieces. But the inverse maneuver is very powerful also, taking several separate things and merging them into one. And if you listen to some of the things that Kent Beck has talked about, he talks about a number of examples where he basically takes 4 or 5 classes, merges them into one thing, then factors them in a different way from that. Sometimes you have to go and merge things in order to actually develop a different structure. And the same thing can happen with like code bases and services and all these other things. So I think that's a maneuver that people quite often don't really think about, and it can be kind of useful. And in many ways, it looks like going backwards because we know that good decomposition is going to be a very important thing for us. So just being able to go and do that sort of thing and recognize that that's a possibility, particularly with like diamond dependencies.
Right.
It's kind of like you're in this situation where, it's kind of like, you've fractured this thing in a way where basically it can't hang together with good structure. So remerging it and going and breaking out things in a different way is the answer.
What do you think is the
jujitsu problem?
What do you think is the relationship between, or maybe the balance between like tactics and philosophy? I think you talk about like that's a tactic you talked about of bring it all into one and then refactor it out. But then there's the overarching philosophy of refactoring, clean code, testing. A good engineer has to have both. What do you think the balance is?
I just know that they feed into each other. It's kind of like if you arrive at a particular philosophy that leads you to think of different tactics, that's good. And quite often people will give you a tactic, and if you actually expand a bit, you can start to see, the foundation of a philosophy and that sort of thing, right? So I don't really think about that in terms of balance as much as two things that play off each other pretty well. And I think that the most important thing is to be able to go back and forth between them, right? I was listening to, is his last name Osterhout? Is that how you say it?
It's like Oosterhout.
Oosterhout, because there's so many people I just know by text, by reading.
I know, right?
Right? Listening to his interview with you, and it's kind of like he was kind of like focusing in on something I've heard a number of people say as well, which is like if you're a good designer, you're going back and forth between different levels of abstraction. Like Grady Bush used to call this round-trip gestalt design. So you're basically going to a high level of abstraction, a low level of abstraction, and going back and forth and trading things off. So it's really this thing of comparing things to different levels of scale that quite often gives us something useful. And you can basically see philosophy and tactics as two different scale levels in a sense, and know that you can't spend your life in just one of them. You'll be stunted. So.
Well, why don't you tell us a bit about how you came to discover software engineering and what drew you to the field?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in my teenage years, there's a computer that came out called the Radio Shack TRS-80. And it was like a really ancient machine back then. Well, back then it wasn't ancient, right?
For our younger viewers, Radio Shack was a company.
Yeah, back then, really. Imagine, right? But there was a friend in the neighborhood whose dad quit his job and got a couple of those machines and started a business with his son. And I'd go over there and they were like loading programs on cassette tapes and all these other things. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. I'll just go back and read math, right? Because I was kind of like a geeky kid. And then a bit later, I got into college and a friend of mine was doing the same thing with IBM PCs. And he was showing me his PC and stuff like that. And he explained to me, what a vector was, an array and stuff like that. And I said, well, where is it in the machine? And it's like, I won't believe you until I know how this maps down to flip-flops and AND gates, because I know what those are, right?
Yeah.
I just didn't want to believe in the abstraction levels. But he kind of convinced me, this friend, it's kind of like, it's like in another 10 years, every program that needs to be written will be written. And it's like, it's pointless to get into programming. And, I took that took that a little too seriously. But it was all very fascinating to me. But I also kind of felt, at least in the teenage years, that it was so fascinating that basically if I got into it then, I would lose my childhood. It's like I just knew myself and my addiction, to areas of thought. I thought, okay, I can get into this now, or do other fun things. So I didn't actually start programming until my early 20s, and did that in school and just dug into it deeply. And I just loved solving problems, and it was fun to go and actually dig into it. And actually, computer science seems to be a decent way of going in sort of like a decent launch off point to where it's getting in different areas of thought. And I always loved that because I'm just a very curious person. So I did that. I was at my university. I was hired by an outside company to write a compiler from scratch, just because my professor recommended me, which I really thank him for. And it was, again, like I was mentioning at the very early end of this, just like sitting in a cubicle by myself and feeling all that pressure of like, I've got to get this working. And so I came I think I come at computer science with a lot of trauma from the beginning, but that helped me go and find better ways of doing things too and learn from people.
I'm fascinated. I found that in so many people. I think Nathan, you and I are both like this, where you get so many people get introduced to computer science at a younger age than they actually start, but then for one reason or another say, "Oh, but I'm going to go explore something else," and then they find their way back to it. Like Nathan, you said you kind of went with some of your theater work, right? You had been doing some computer science stuff, but it took you a while to find your way back to the industry.
Yeah, it was really weird. I had a retired Texas Instruments software engineer was teaching a computer science class at my high school,
Mm-hmm.
and I took the class. I enjoyed it, but he took me under his wing, and I actually like competed in a programming competition. Never thought anything of it. Like I think I got like
Yeah.
third place in the state or whatever. I messed up some offsetting of a digit or something. I think I would have won, but um, I just thought of I had friends who were like engineers and super technical, and I didn't think of myself as that. And I was always like much more creative. So I went into like sound design, but then I was like
Oh, cool.
building computers to do sound design. Like it never like came to my mind that actually merging these two together. And then now I've flipped around entirely, and all of my theater background is actually all the researching source material, working cross-functionally, all the stuff that came out of this liberal arts education has actually been really useful now that I'm working, in software engineering and platform engineering work. So I had a very wandering path. I
Yeah,
wouldn't tell
I always
someone to go
appreciate
that way.
people who do, because it's kind of like you have depth in other areas you're able to bring to it and bring a different perspective, right? And I actually started learning computer science after having had a job in industry doing programming related stuff, and it's kind of like I'm sitting around all these people who are basically seeing these things for the first time, but they didn't know how to go and really um, take what they were learning in computer science and map it to the world, because they didn't see the problems ahead of time, right? They hadn't struggled, I think, to go and actually get something working, and then seem that kind of thing. There's something to that.
That's
I've
interesting.
joked on this podcast before, but my first job out of college was working for Disney, doing software for them. But if you
Mhm.
had told me in high school, like I was a big Disney fan, and so I would love to work for the company. But if you had told me what you're going to work for Disney, what's the job? Like I honestly would have guessed I was running the churro cart before I would have guessed that I was a software engineer.
Yeah,
It came out of total left field for me, in part because I had always I don't think myself nearly as creative as Nathan is, but I was very social, and I was
Mhm.
like, but I don't want to just like sit and stare at a computer all day. So yeah, I that's one reason I really enjoyed your book, because you can't disentangle the programming from the social nature of it. Even a
yeah,
lot of the end of the book is, in fact, that's actually the kind of the title we went for on the thumbnail, was how attitude affects programming, because a
yeah,
lot of working with legacy code isn't just the nuts and bolts of the code, but the social dynamics of the team, keeping morale up, communicating with others. Yeah, it's really cool to see all that kind of stuff intertwines.
yeah. No, definitely is. And it's like, if you love systems, like I said, computer science is a gateway, because we model every system that we can imagine using software. And so we have to go and have some model about how things work, and that's the exploratory path, figuring out models.
What we want to give you, since you've listened to some of the episodes, if you have any bones to pick with us, or if there's anything we said or anything you wanted to respond to in the episodes, we want to make sure you
Yeah,
have time to
what?
do that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it was kind of funny. I was looking at, like I've only seen the first episode you did with me and heard a little bit of Osterhoots. Um, I think that one thing I want to kind of mention is this thing about like deep and narrow abstractions, that kind of like uncovers a lot of interesting things. And I think when people have objections to TDD, they've fallen into a trap that I fell into very early with it. And I think it's a trap that's really kind of born of the incentive structure in a way, right? If we're writing tests, we have to write them in a class, right? And we are creating classes. So it's very easy to start thinking that we should be in a one-to-one realm, right? Where we have like one test case class for every class that we're working on, right? And then at that point, we start to think about the classes as being the unit of design in a way. And I think that this is kind of problematic, and it's an easy thing to do, because quite often it's groups of coordinating classes that actually do things for us. And we can actually see that as being like an encapsulation boundary in a sense also, right? So we can look at the public interface of a class as being the API, but I quite often think that the APIs that we care about are basically at a larger level. It's like when we have several classes coordinating and doing something, there may be only 5 or 6 functions outside of that grouping of classes that the outside world's going to particularly care about. So Martin Fowler talks about published versus public interfaces, and how, the ones that you publish are ones you don't want to change because other people depend upon them. And public is just like in that local context. I think it's kind of sad that we don't really have a word for that slightly bigger context in computer science, because it is a unit of design, I believe. And, we'll use the word like component or module or service or something like that. But there's a lot that kind of applies more at that level than it applies at, say, the class level. For my own practice with TDD, quite often, it took me a long time to realize this, because what I would typically do is I'd write a couple of tests and write some code that satisfies them. And then as I keep on adding tests, I'm making the thing bigger, and I'm starting to refactor out from it and start to go and basically make all those little pieces and almost have something which is almost like a mini integration test in a way. And that's been a lot of my practice. And so it's kind of like I arrive at these clusters that feel like they should be the units. But we don't see them directly in the code. That's the problem, So, yeah.
That's a really interesting distinction. And I will say, like, as I got I think I had a hot take in the first half, and then I think you addressed a lot of I was like, oh no, but this will get really messy. And then you're like, actually, this will get really messy if you go too far with this. And I was like, okay. It was interesting too. And I do appreciate all the code examples, because, most of my time I've spent on a number of languages that I could count on one hand. And so it's good for me to have to stretch and go, oh, okay, this is how you would express this in this language, or here's some cool keywords that kind of give constraints for, how you'd idiomatically do something. And so I did appreciate that in the work as well.
I get cold sweats whenever I see C, because I've never worked in C professionally, and I've only done it in like some really difficult operating systems classes. And I just have memories of like the night before the assignment's due. I'm like, oh gosh, why isn't it compiling? It's seeing. I appreciate. Yeah, it's funny reading some of these old books. We laugh with we laugh twice, because in Brian Kernahan's Practice of Programming, one thing he does is he says, no one's written a good CSV compiler or a CSV parser, so we're going to write one here. And then we told him in the interview, we're like, hey, isn't that funny? Because now there are a ton of good CSV parser. But he was like, there's still not a good one. So,
I do love old books, because, at least for me, it's not just in computer science. Like, every once in a while, I'll go to a garage sale and pick up old magazines from like the 1960s or 70s, because it's almost like a time machine where you basically sort of like, you can't read for very long before you start to imagine yourself being in that position and seeing the world from that point of view. And for me, point of view is everything. If you can see an abstraction in a different way or program in a different way, you've got extra stuff. And it's like to basically do that with like history and social context is so cool. So I love those old books. I think the one I really got into a lot was Software Tools in Pascal, right? And it was just basically going and sort of building out some of these small pieces that they could piece together. And you could see all the reasoning, but you also understood more about what the world was like back then, and it's just, fascinating to me,
How do you avoid getting pigeonholed in your point of view? I think software engineers can be stubborn people sometimes and just get really dogmatic about their particular philosophy. How do you keep an open mind?
One thing I believe in a great deal is going and developing awareness of the felt sense of when you're going to get in trouble, right? And it's a hard thing to communicate, but it's kind of like, if you get used to the feeling of like, this is triggering me, this is really bothering me what this person is saying, because it's totally against the way that I see things. Get used to that feeling and remember it. And when it comes up again, you can say, oh, it's kind of like, this thing, it's not necessarily true. It's a feeling, and it's making me angry, probably because I'm jealous or something, probably because it's like they're telling me something that's going to negate all my stuff, and maybe I don't know everything I think I know, right? And then to look beyond that. But it's, for me, really kind of a feeling level thing. Just getting used to what that feels like, and knowing that that's something that is information for you. That's at least the way it works for me.
That's cool.
And there's a thing I always remind myself is that the world is always bigger than what we know, right?
Hmm.
It's kind of like, it's just this thing of like, you can say there's no answer in this situation because you can only see 5 alternatives. And it's like, go outside, look around. It's kind of
Yeah.
like talk to somebody. It's bigger than just the inside of your head, right? And that's the fact that you're ignorant should be a joyful experience because, otherwise you can get kind of like trapped in your own thoughts, right?
I find that a tough balance to walk because I always want to try to do what's right. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm not so interested in like I yeah, I want to be a good person. I want to do what's right and correct. And so then the idea that later on you would be wrong, well, I want to change because like I said, I want to be right, but at the same time, then if you worry about being wrong because that means maybe you weren't doing the right things to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to walk.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is it's not just about us, it's about the consequences in the world, right? So sometimes we
Mhm.
beat ourselves up about things that are totally inconsequential, right? And then and then the regrets I have in life are people that I've hurt and didn't realize it at the time,
Right.
and then realized it's like, wow, didn't think this thing had consequences, but it really did. And it's like, that's a thing to care about. But the internal standard that I have for myself, it's kind of like, that's a game I'm playing with myself and it doesn't have to be that serious.
I liked in the software architecture book we read with Mark Richards and Neil Ford. They
Hmm.
they talk a lot about the least worst design. Like you just
Hmm.
sometimes that's really the best we can hope for is like the least worst. Maybe this is actually the best, but the
Yeah.
best is also the best is the local maximum of least worst.
Hmm. And it's kind of funny when you talk about tactics and strategy, I guess, a bit earlier. It's kind of like there's this thing of like, how do we balance aspiration and kind of like pragmatics? It's kind of like, because I think we all get better when we become aspirational. It's kind of like, well, I'm going to make the best system I possibly can. And then in the back of your mind, it's going to be a trade off, a set of trade offs, but still maintaining the belief that it can be much better than it is powerful motivation, and it's a bit of an ego boost to, you get a bit of a payoff when you feel you're on that track too. So,
So I think the best case scenario with someone reading this book would be they're a CTO or they're an outside consultant brought in. They've really absorbed it, have it into their philosophy, and they have the capacity to make changes, right?
mhm.
What if you're a mid-level engineer and you're working in a legacy code base, but you come across this book, maybe you heard about it through the podcast, right? You read it, you start feeling aspirational, you feel like things can change, but you don't have necessarily that hard power to make decisions. How would you recommend that someone approaches a legacy code base from that perspective?
Well, I think the thing that's kind of funny is that people don't like to be told things; they like to discover things themselves, just in general, right? And it's very tough because it's not just the legacy code thing; it's also a lot of coaching and consulting that you're working with people, and quite often it's like if you come in all gangbusters and say, "Yeah, we're going to do it this way," you're going to get pushback. It's just a natural human reaction. So I think that the best thing to do quite often is to just model better behavior, right? If you don't have to tell people you're doing a good job, if kind of like you're able to go and you're able to go and get features in a little bit quicker than other people, or your code has a little bit less in the way of bugs, the people that are curious about that, who want to actually get better themselves, will come to you, right? There's also a little bit of an art to going and offering a suggestion and then somehow kind of circling somebody back to the idea that because they didn't take that suggestion earlier, this, and this happened. And you don't want to make people feel bad, but it's also kind of like to be a little bit of a voice of the history of decision making within an organization. To go and help people arrive at better paths towards understanding things can be valuable too. So there's a lot of humility involved in it. You can't come across as like an expert or something like that, or like somebody who's going to go and offer the manna from heaven that's going to save everybody, right? Because that turns people off if you're in a group of peers. I mean, for me, it's kind of like I come in with all this baggage of kind of like, hey, he's the expert in this, right? So I have to
Mm.
deal with that stuff regardless. But you can avoid that problem by going in sort of like not not basically sort of like presenting yourself as the person who has the truth, but approach the people who want to find better ways and help them find better ways. And I think that that's the thing that's most important on teams is to get people directionally focused on getting better, right? And it's like you find very quickly that some people really care about that a lot more people than other people do. If you don't care about getting better, it's like I can work with you, but it's not the best situation.
Well, so you talk about that kind of wanting to have that light touch. I mean, what do you think? Well, what if you've burned some credibility already? Maybe you came in guns a blazing. Um, how do you make amends? What do you
Well,
think?
yeah, you just basically take other people's suggestions, you know, and sometimes you may think it's a bad suggestion, but it's kind of like, you can, give your objections or something like that, but you can kind of like, it's like eating crow in a way. It's kind of like you have to, get people to trust you, by going in and saying, letting them see that you value them and their opinions, right? That it's not just all about yours.
We found that to be an important or a recurring theme on this podcast is the importance of humility.
Yeah.
And I think it's tough to balance as a software engineer because I'm biased, but I think what we do is really cool. And
Mhm.
and I think you can, and I think there are some people who come to this industry maybe, so this is a geeky industry, right? And so you might have
Yeah.
people who maybe weren't good at sports or didn't get the girl they wanted or something like that. And all of a sudden here they are in this field doing really cool stuff and they're really good at it and it often pays
Mhm.
very well. It can get to your head. And I think it's important to retain that humility.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's one thing that I keep coming back to, and I don't know why I'm peculiar in this way. It's really something that's put me at a bit of odds with like the agile community and stuff like that. It's like I think that people are very, very important, but if we focus on the people end of things too much, we lose the uniting thing. And what I mean by this is it's kind of like, we're how we feel is important. All these other things are important, but it's also kind of like what is the thing that we are doing, right? What is the thing that we care about? One of the things I thought was just so fascinating early in my career was going in and giving a talk at a company that made cardiac pacemakers. And it's kind of cool because, after the talk, they took me to the cafeteria and we sat down, we're having food and stuff like that. I said, what are all these pictures on the wall? And they said, there were pictures of people. And I said, who are these people? And I said, these are all people whose lives were saved by our
Oh,
pacemakers.
wow.
And it's kind of like, that's when you realize it's not just you, right? It's kind of like, imagine SpaceX. It's not like, it's like we're going to Mars or something like that, right? Or imagine just anything like that, or the medical things. It's just like there are some things that are a bit bigger than us, right? And that basically it's like when we focus on those, we get to unite together on things a bit. And I don't want to denigrate. I think that it's very important for everybody to feel comfortable and safe and everything like that. But sometimes we can get into a space where we kind of lose the idea that we're doing things that are important to the world. And that's where our focus needs to be sometimes. So I realize it's an atypical view, but something that's been important for me all my life.
Oh, I love it.
So you'd actually referenced books earlier, a couple of books, like the Pascal book. This is a book-based podcast. We love books,
Mm-hmm.
and we always love to ask the authors, um, are there any books that were particularly impactful to you, or are there books that you find yourself recommending to others?
In development, a lot of the things are just kind of, I keep going back and recommending the DDD book, Domain Driven Design by Eric
Uh-huh.
Evans, just because it's a great way of framing software development. And he introduces terminology that, he introduces a ubiquitous language, which includes the term ubiquitous language, right? So I think that's a great one to go and actually dig back into. I don't know. I mean, my bookshelf is right here. I can just start pulling things off the shelf, you know? Um, a lot of my favorite books are really things that are outside of software development. And it's just because I tend to be very curious about things. Um, I'm reading a lot of philosophy now, I guess, or just listening to podcasts around it, just because I really appreciate different points of view around the world. One thing I've been getting into is like there's a psychoanalyst named Jacques Lacan from the 20th century. And it's kind of funny because psychoanalysis is one of those areas that's very highly conceptual, where people can kind of like wonder whether there's really empirical grounding to it. But the thing that I really appreciate is that he was really facile at creating concepts to describe things. And so for me, as somebody who's more technical, it's kind of fun to go and actually sort of see how he plays with ambiguity in order to go and get some points across. So that's a fascinating thing.
I love that.
All my adult life, I've been reading Supreme Court decisions for fun.
Oh, wow.
Because back when I was in college, I basically had 2 electives left over before my bachelor's, and I decided to take 2 sections of constitutional law just out of curiosity at the same time. And so it's been kind of fun because you see how the law intersects with public opinion and with culture and all these things, and basically how people use logic, but also know how to go and actually sort of massage it in different ways, which may be positive or negative, right?
June must be
But
a fun month for you.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of fun. It's kind of, I listen to the oral arguments and stuff like that. It's almost, some people like soap operas. I like these, right? But I think to me, I just love digging into technical areas that are outside of software because I think I'm able to take an awful lot back. I love music an awful lot also, right? So I just like very interesting technical music. And yeah, it's just, I think that these exposures to different things, like Nathan, you talked about theater and stuff like that. All those things basically give us these different perspectives and end up going and sort of like informing our work.
Well, I love what you said, where really software is just a model of the real world. You can't
Yeah.
disentangle it from that. And so branching out and getting this expertise in all these other industries is valuable. Makes you a better software engineer.
Yeah, it's all about going and developing different models. And the thing is, it's like there's the old saying, I forget who said this, but it's like not, all models are false and some are useful. So the more that you have, put them on as different sets of glasses to seize things and quite often arrive at, you know, solutions or ways of solving problems that might be atypical. And I think that's fun.
Well, is there any final thoughts you want to leave with our listeners? You mentioned this new book you're working on. Anything you want to pitch, make anyone aware of?
Not much beyond that, except I still enjoy the legacy code and technical debt stuff. So it's kind of like reach out, it's fun. And I think
Absolutely.
it's what I love about this work is that if you're a curious person, this is a gold mine. It's like there's nothing like trying to go and understand something that you've never seen before.
Yeah.
And that's a fun thing to do. I enjoy it. So.
Well, if you need help with legacy code, this is the man who can do
Cool.
it. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Michael. If you haven't listened to the episodes, listeners, we have 2 great episodes on working effectively with legacy code. We mentioned some of our other interviews, the Osterhout interview, the Kernighan interview. We've interviewed Neil Ford and Mark Richards. So please check those out too. And again, Michael, we just can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for being kind and generous with your time.
For taking the time digging into all this. It's great to see it exposed a lot more.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's one of the things we love about this podcast is just how much knowledge is available in our industry. And, just to be able to, and we're really believe in we live in a world of short form content, and it's so important to engage with long form ideas.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
You find so much when you read a book like this over 2 weeks where, there's a lot of like attitudes where you're like, oh yeah, I get that. I agree with that. But only after kind of really wrestling with it for an extended period of time does it cement yourself. So Thank you so much for writing the book. It was really a pleasure reading it. Well, great. Well, thank you, listeners. You can find us on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. I'm on Twitter at Carter Morgan. Michael, do you want to plug your Twitter, or is that more of a private thing?
Yes, Feathers on Twitter, and I'm available there. I don't really tweet as much as I used to. I have a Substack also, michael.feathers, substack.com.
Well, great. Well, thanks, listeners, for tuning in. And thank you, Michael, so much for being here. And we will see you all next time.
Thanks.